Cool. So yeah, hi, I'm Phil. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm just part of the church. How long have I been part of the church now? 2 years. 2 years? Yeah, there we go. You know, not a world record, but interesting fact. Anyway, so this sermon today is about preparing our hearts to be a provision for Newcastle and for the North East. And if you don't live in Newcastle or the North East, it's still relevant to you because you can replace Newcastle with wherever you live. But it's about preparing our hearts to be a provision. If there's two things I want you to come away from today, it would be what does it look like to prepare our hearts to be a provision? And also, I just really love the Word. I love the Bible. It's got so much depth and richness, and Jesus speaks through it all the time. And I'd love it if you were even slightly more excited about it in an hour's time. It's not going to take an hour. But okay, in half an hour's time, then you are now. Cool. So, and also, this is just. I feel like this is really a sermon just as much for me. I'm really preaching to myself about a lot of things here, so I'm very much not sitting here high and mighty and declaring things over you. Cool. So it's Genesis 14. So we're going to pick up where we left off last week. And just for those there's a few people who are new or visiting today. So just for those who weren't here last week, the summary in a sentence of last week's preach was, God is faithful when we are faithless. And that's Genesis 13 story. And that's really important because it really contextualizes what we're going to talk about today. God is faithful when we are faithless. Okay, so I'm going to need some help. I need a volunteer to be Sodom. Who would like to be Sodom? Excellent, Sodom. It doesn't get better because I need a volunteer to be Babylon. Who would like to be Babylon? Excellent, Nathaniel. And then we've got a wonderful Lot. Who's Lot? Carmen, you put your hand up for Babylon, so you can be Lot. No, so Lot needs to be with Sodom. Okay, so let's set the scene. In the green corner, we have scrappy underdog Sodom has been fighting underneath the thumb of Babylon for the last few years and is the dark horse in this fight. And then your friend Lot. Okay, and then we've got the beast from the east. In the red corner, it's the winner of the 2000 BC Grand Slam Mesopotamia world champion 3 years in a row, Babylon. Okay, so who are you cheering for? Babylon or Sodom? The answer is neither. Because what this text is trying to show us is that where it starts, we've got 4 kings who are living under Babylon, and then we've got 5 kings with Sodom and Gomorrah, and these 5 kings have been subject to Babylon, and now they're rebelling. We are not supposed to be cheering for either of these two people. If you know anything about the Old Testament, you'll know that these are not good figures. Basically, it's what's going on in the world right now. Wars and rumors of wars, chaos, the world falling into the chaos of people taking and wanting to beat each other up, basically. And so we're not supposed to be cheering for either of these two teams, but this is what's going on right now. So we've got these different kings here. The 4 kings in the east, they fight the 5 kings in the west, and Babylon wins. There's a knockout punch. And Sodom runs away, but Lot gets taken by Babylon. Yeah. Okay. So you can sit down now. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. In the middle of all this stuff, Okay. In the middle of all this stuff going on, we have Abram. I'm going to make this mistake so many times, guys. I'm so sorry. Abram, he's not Abraham yet, is chilling by a place called the Oaks of Mamre. And he's just sitting there chilling, and there's some other people around him, some guys called the Amorites, which is a local tribe, and they're just sort of sitting like a little bubble in the middle of all this, not affected at all. So let's pick up the story at 14 to 16, if you've got your Bibles or your Bible apps out. So when Abram heard that his kinsman, that's Lot, had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and the women and the people. So when Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, so Lot's his nephew, he called out the 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit. Then in verse 17, he basically defeats them all, and he comes back, and so Damascus is actually like 100 miles north of where he is. So it's a long way. So he's chased them a long way, and then he's come back a long way. Incidentally, Damascus is also like the limit of the promised land, and so Abram, in the previous chapter, God told him to do a tour of the promised land, and he missed out on that. He went down to Egypt instead, but God's got him to complete his tour of the promised land. And he comes back 100 miles, and the king of Sodom comes out to meet him. I should bring you back up again, but I'm not going to. So 21, and the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have lifted my hand to the Lord Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not even take a thread, or a sandal strap, or anything that is yours, lest you say, 'I have made Abram rich.' I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten," because that would be a bit disgusting, "and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share." And Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre are the three of the Amorites who are living with him by the tree. So there's three themes which really jumped out at me as I was going through this story today. And I'm going to go through each one and talk about how I think they relate to us today, and also ultimately point to Jesus. So the first theme is the theme of seeing and taking. So for this, we have to go back, all the way back to Eden, and basically the Bible is meditation literature. It's stuff we're not supposed to just read straight through it like you would a normal book. You're meant to pause and think and talk in the community and share your thoughts. And if there's like a bit of imagery that reminds you of something else in the Bible, it's supposed to, because it's all interlinked. It's like a giant web of things. And if there's like a cool meaning that's associated with another story with a bit of imagery somewhere else, and then it crops up over here, you're supposed to take that meaning and sort of think on it and be like, well, how has this changed this story? So we've got this theme of seeing and taking. So if we go back to the garden, we've got Adam and Eve in the garden, and there's this very specific language where Adam and Eve, they see the fruit that is good, and they take it for themselves. So they see that it's good, and they take it. This language is really important because that same language crops up again and again and again and again all the way through the story. And every time it's kind of building on that meaning, and it's showing us a really important decision, because they're seeing that it's good and they're taking. What was the other choice? God's faithfulness and God's provision. And they're choosing what looks good in their own eyes rather than choosing God's faithfulness and God's provision. They're not choosing to trust, they're choosing to trust themselves. So we see this again in Noah, in the story of Noah, where all the way through up until that point, people are seeing and taking, and all the stories. If you read it through, look for the word seeing and taking. You'll see it comes up all the time. Every time there's an important decision which comes where there's like sin that comes in, it's because people are seeing and taking. So in Noah, there's this story where basically he kind of falls to debauchery, and again it's the same word of seeing comes in, and then we see it again, and sort of sin comes in and it spreads out until the Tower of Babel, where man tries to make himself into the image of God again, and God does another reset, and this time by scattering the people. And this brings us to Abram. And pretty much the first thing that God invites Abram to be is to be a provision to the nations. And he gives a blessing to Abram, and through Abram to the world. So that's what happens in the previous chapter, but of course, what happens right after that? Right after God invites him to be a provision to the nations, is that Abram, when there's a famine and he gets to choose to trust God's provision, he runs down to Egypt. And what's really interesting here is that actually the same language is happening, but this time Abram's like the snake. So Pharaoh sees that Sarai is beautiful or good in his eyes and takes her. And as a result, he leads Egypt into sin. But in this case, Abraham's been like the snake. But hold on, wasn't Abraham meant to be a provision to the nations? And through his own choice in the previous chapter of his faithlessness, he was meant to be a provision, but he's become like the snake. He's like the opposite of the provision. He's the anti-provision. What's really good, and is that Abraham realizes his problem, realizes his mistake, comes back, and he makes things right with God, and God is faithful, and God restores him. God doesn't hold this over him, because this is right at the beginning of Abraham's story. We haven't got to the bit yet where God's given the full depth of the blessing of I'm going to through your line I'm going to provide for the whole world. He's kind of given a short version of that promise, but he's yet to make that full covenant. So it looks like Abraham's maybe learnt something here, because God splits Abraham and Lot. And again, there's this contrast here where they're choosing where to go in the land, and Lot sees the land that is good in his own eyes near Sodom, and he takes it, and he goes over there. But Abraham remembers God's faithfulness, remembers God's promise, and he accepts the promise that God gives. And so this is where the story kind of picks up here, is that in this middle of this sort of grand slam fight here, where those choices left them? Well, Lot was living in the neighborhood of Sodom, which is like sin, and he's actually been drawn in, and now he's actually living in sin, and now he's been carried away by the world because he was seeing what looked good in his own eyes and taking it. But Abraham, he's also still living in the middle of the world. He's actually living in the middle of the Amorites. But what's different is that instead of being taken away by that, he is actually reversing that situation, and it's become like a provision. So he's providing for the Amorites. And in a story sort of remarkably similar to lots of other things in the Old Testament, if you know about Gideon or David, he takes 318 men, which isn't that many. If you think you've just got 4 kings, which had just smashed 5 kings, I think they're going to have more than 318 men, probably quite a lot more. And he takes 318 men and he drives them 100 miles and takes all their stuff. And then we come back. So Abraham's back to that place of being a provision. And so what else is happening in the story? So we've got Sodom is trying to get Abraham to take what is good in his eyes. So Sodom's trying to say, in verses 21 to 24, I'll have the people, but you can keep the stuff. You can have it. That's fine. And actually, to be fair, Abraham's fought the battle, hasn't he? He's got a pretty reasonable justification. He could say, you know what? I earned that. That belongs to me. I fought for that. So what's the big deal? What's the big deal of keeping all this stuff that I earned? Well, it's really important to understand that in ancient culture, and this is still the case in some places in the world today, is that if you accept a big gift, it puts you in the other person's debt. And that's pointed out to us in the text. If we didn't know that already, it says, lest you should say, I have made Abraham rich. So Abraham doesn't want to be in debt to Sodom or sin. And Sodom is like a metaphor. It shows the traps that so easily entangle us and lead us somewhere like Abraham to Egypt, where we might be the opposite of what God's designed us to be. So we believe that the Bible is a unified story that leads to Jesus. So let's look at Jesus now. So it's through Jesus' choice to lay down his own self, to serve God and love us, that he demonstrates this. So Jesus, in the temptation in the wilderness, several times he's offered the choice. It's the same thing happening. You know how Sodom comes to Abraham's like, you can keep this, just as long as you sort of bow down and worship me. There's this same thing that goes on here, that Jesus is in the wilderness, that the devil comes to him and offers him stuff. He offers him sustenance, he offers him power, he offers him protection, just as long as he'll bow down. Will you take what is good in your own eyes? Or what happens in the Garden of Gethsemane? So he chooses to say, God, I trust you, even though this looks hard. I will take from you, Jesus. Or not Jesus, from you, God. And I will trust in your promise and not take this thing which looks good in my own eyes, but I will trust you even to death. He surrenders his life. So just thinking about what this means for us today, like surrendering what we think looks great to us in favor of what God is saying. Could this be a lens for us of how we look at the whole world, look at the big choices in our lives, the little choices in our lives, for how we seek to be a church for the Northeast, for Newcastle? It could also be maybe is there a pattern of sin in our lives where we're choosing to take what looks good in our own eyes? What does it look like to actually trust God's ways? Maybe they're better for us. It might even be more subtle than that. What if it's just about obedience? Have we hidden ourselves from God because we don't want to ask what he's saying? Do we trust that he's good enough that we'll listen to his voice and listen to his promises and choose to follow those? And I just want to pause there. I was just reminded through a lot of the worship today, like a lot of the words there about just the depth of God's love for us. And if there's anyone in the room right now who's even feeling like a tiny, tiny bit of shame or a tiny, tiny bit of guilt or condemnation, that is not from Jesus. That is not from God. That's not from me either. That is from the devil, who's trying to bring you down, is trying to tear you down, he's trying to whisper things in your ear. You do not need to listen to that voice. You do not need to listen to that voice. That voice doesn't belong to you. You don't belong to that voice either. All the words given basically through worship, I was really encouraged. It's just about Jesus really likes you. He really likes you. And if Abraham, I don't know if any of you have led an entire nation into sin. But if Abraham can do that and the next chapter be a provision to the nations, I think God can fix any kind of problems that you've made. Do you know what I mean? All right. The second theme is the theme of the garden, and this is basically that the trees of memory are supposed to be a mini Eden, and so are you. So, what is Eden? So Eden is trees on a mountain. I don't know, I'm doing actions, YMCA, yeah, that's all right. I should have thought, actually, I could have done like trees on a mountain. God's original design. Where humanity is walking about and a river is flowing out. Yeah. It rhymes. Oh. Thank you. Walking about, flowing out, walking about, flowing out. Sorry, right, okay. I'm getting carried away. Sorry, you're giving me too much power. Okay, so there's 4 rivers coming from the mountain and they're flowing out. And what's interesting is that, like, if you go back to the Genesis story, the 4 places it describes, they're not near each other, and rivers don't flow from the same place to there. They're describing the 4 corners of the earth. And so it's to say that this river, okay, have we talked about rivers this morning already? Yeah? What was God speaking to us about rivers this morning? Anyone? His love, yeah. Anything else? Who had words about rivers? Well, basically, it was rivers of God's love, of His faithfulness, of His provision. It's He's providing through His love for the entire world. Is coming out and flowing out. And then we see the same imagery that Noah, after the flood, he's on a mountain. Recognize that one before? He's on a mountain. And what does he do on the mountain? He plants a garden. It's coming back to Eden, coming back to the promise. And what was Noah doing before the flood that sort of picked him out as being faithful to God? He was walking about. It's the same word. It's a very specific word. It's not like other words for walking. It's a very specific word, which means walking about. And that's what saves him. And Noah is a provision to the nations through the ark, through the shelter from the storm. Mamre means seeing in Hebrew, which is interesting because we've talked about seeing already, but it's kind of like a complete, like flipping on its head. What's he seeing? He's not seeing what's good in his own eyes. He's seeing God. There's trees, like on a garden. Is it a stretch to say when you're seeing down in the valley, maybe you're in a high place? Because that's where the battle's happening. It's happening in a valley. And do you know what? Just if you weren't getting it already, one of Mamre, he's an Amorite as well, he's one of his brothers called Eshcol, which means garden grape cluster. So the oaks of Mamre are like a mini Eden. So God's original design is a place where there's provision for all the world in God's blessing to Adam and the 4 rivers pouring out and going to all the world. In the story of Noah, there's provision for all the world through God's blessing to Noah, the same blessing for Adam and the ark, which saves the world. At Mamre, Abraham's just chilling, untouched in this bubble. It's like the ark in the storm, of the storms going around. It's this ark in the storm. It's this protection, but not just that. But then Abraham flows out from that place and washes away Babylon. This is like, I think this is imagery that we're supposed to get, that he washes away Babylon, and especially when Babylon's meant to be sin. That's kind of what the imagery for Babylon is through the Bible. So let's track this forwards all the way to Jesus. Is that the right way? Like you're saying about going right to left, I don't know what is. Which way makes sense to you if I'm going that way? It tracks forward to Jesus. So the next important image as we're following that track, where we next see the garden imagery really clearly, is the tabernacle, which is the tent where the Israelites, when they're in the desert, God was dwelling amongst them, and the tabernacle is designed to look like a garden. Tabernacle becomes the temple, and the temple, through Jesus, becomes you. God has made you living temples. He's made you mini Edens. So all this imagery that we've been tracking with here, that's what's inside of you. You are a place of refuge from the storm. You are a place where rivers flow out to be a provision to the nations. Through Jesus, God has been pleased to dwell in us. We are high places of vision and seeing God, where we walk about with God and take the good news to the nations. So what does it mean to be a provision to the northeast as living temples of holy pouring out? At one of the prayer meetings through the last few weeks, someone had a word about holiday hunger. And I'll just give this as an example. There's so holiday hunger, basically about kids not being able to eat during the holidays. It's a big problem in our area. And two other people had words about feeding the lambs, not just feeding the sheep, feeding the lambs. And I just felt like we were supposed to pray for these people as examples of what it means to be a practical provision, but also to look at Jesus through that. And it wasn't actually anything about these people being super holy or special, selected amongst us. But it's actually just praying for them so that we're all blessed as a whole church. And so that we carry this in our DNA as a church. And it doesn't just have to be about holiday hunger. It can be about any kind of thing that God's pointing out to you, that is saying, this is an injustice that I want to correct. Also, the other thing that I thought about was about just, right now there's a lot of scary stuff going on in the world. There's wars and rumors of wars. Babylon's beating up Sodom. There's a lot of stuff happening like that. And actually, we're invited to be the ark. We're invited to be a place of shelter in the middle of the storm. Not just for ourselves, so that we feel good, but so the Amorites can gather around and be part of the blessing. So the people who don't know God yet can be part of the blessing. I think just those two things jumped out at me, just what it looks like to look at Jesus and let his justice flow out into the world and be part of that. And what does it mean to also be that place of safety and provision and peace, knowing that God is above even these wars happening, even all this injustice, even all this thing which is causing terror and fear. Did anyone notice I skipped a bit? Yeah. It's not just because I can't read the Bible. I promise. So, when Abraham comes back all the way from defeating Babylon, there's not just Sodom, but there's someone else waiting for him. Verse 18. And Melchizedek, king of Salem. Of course, we all know who Melchizedek is, right? Yeah. Everyone tracking, yeah? If you are, then you're not. You can come up here and explain it. Who's Melchizedek? Like, it doesn't explain that. It doesn't. It just introduces him as, yeah, we know who he is. And maybe we just need to give them a bit of time, because maybe they'll come back and explain it later. Maybe they'll come back and say, well, actually, he was this guy and he was from this line and he was really important because he comes back in the narrative and does all these things. Melchizedek does not appear again after this, except for a very brief, strange reference in Psalm 110, which doesn't make anything clearer. In fact, he doesn't come back until Hebrews. So we'll just finish this bit and we'll jump back to what Hebrews says. So Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. And he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything he had. So, I want to stay on point, so I'm going to go only into a little bit of this today. We could do an entire sermon on on Melchizedek and Hebrews, and we're not going to do that today. But basically, Melchizedek is a cookie cutter for Jesus. He's a cookie cutter. I can't make the actions, sorry. He's a cookie cutter with a crown and priestly robes together. Carmen, when I was prepping this, asked, why are you saying cookie cutter and not template? It would be clearer. Thank you. And the reason why I've chosen this very deliberately is because a template is the starter from which all things follow, and a cookie cutter is the promise of things to come. Cookie cutter. Say it again. A template is the starter, which is the image from which all things follow. Cookie cutter is the shape and the promise of what is to come. And I tell you what, in Jesus, that cookie cutter Melchizedek gets filled out in all its sugary, glorious goodness. So Melchizedek, as I say, is cookie cutter, specifically the unification of ruler living out the purpose of God. So God asked us to be rulers in the garden, to live out the purpose, and priest living in relationship with God, coming together. This is what it means to be a provision to the nations, to be rulers and priests together. So as we trace this forward to Jesus, we see that Jesus is the image of the king and the priest, not choosing to take for himself and rule at the cost of others, but be a servant king, laying down his life for us and for God. So in the story, what does this show us about Jesus? So Melchizedek, he comes out to serve Abraham with bread and wine. Familiar? He gives God's blessing that matches and reinforces the first blessing that God gives Abraham earlier, and Abraham gives him the tithe. Jesus serves us with his body and his blood and gives us God's blessing. In return, we freely recognize that what we have is his. There's another deliberate contrast going on here. These guys, Sodom and Melchizedek, are with Abraham at the same time, but his reaction to them both is totally opposite. We've already talked about his refusal to be in debt to Sodom. But then Abraham, he accepts Melchizedek's gift of blessing and sustenance and is so overwhelmed by that he gives 10% of everything he has to Melchizedek. And that's the origins of the tithe. So he's happy to respond and give back and invest in God's blessing. Abraham had a choice here to take what looked good in his own eyes or to give back to God and recognize that what he had belongs to God in the first place. So let's talk about money. This is a difficult one because I think that in England, talking about money and tithing is difficult. It's an awkward conversation often. I love awkward conversations. And in my experience, I don't know, I've lived for a time in North America. I've seen lots of North American preachers. In North America, they love talking about money. They love talking about tithing, to the point that I felt very uncomfortable most of the time. They'd have a mini sermon about tithing every time they did it. And it made me really uncomfortable. And I wonder maybe if we've gone so far the opposite that maybe we don't talk about it enough. Where does your money come from? Who does it belong to? What is your allegiance to it? I think the times that I've been probably least attached to money is probably when I had the least amount of it. That was when it was easiest to be generous. Does that mean it's better to not have any? No. It's also great having more money and be able to invest in the kingdom and provide for others in more in different ways, but it can also feel harder to do that. You shouldn't be guilty about having money or ashamed for not having money. It doesn't matter if you have lots or don't have much. Both come with different pressures and different challenges. What matters is where is your heart at with that. Abraham lays down 10%, which has become quite a reused figure. I think it's a good figure because it's for some people it's not enough to maybe affect the bottom line or to you can get around it with budgeting. For some it's an aspirational goal to get to, but it's also enough to sort of feel that and to prompt you to make that choice. Are we going to see what looks good in our own eyes and take it and keep it? Or are we going to trust God's provision and God's faithfulness? The reason I found it easiest when I didn't have much was because I got to see God provide loads. So I actually have huge faith for housing provision. Every single story every time I've ever moved house since I left home, there's been just like a miraculous story associated with it. In my first move, I was hoping to live with all my friends from uni in second year, and they all left me and got a house by themselves. And I felt very rejected. You can all go, oh, thank you, I feel better. But actually it was God's provision, because that house was an unmitigated disaster. They had huge falling outs, they had huge issues in the house. It was like I dodged a massive bullet. And God provided for me for housing through a prophetic word through a non-Christian. I can tell you more about this story later, but it was mad. It was like someone came up to me and said, I feel like you're supposed to talk to someone else about getting a house together. He didn't even know I knew this person. I didn't even know this guy very well. Anyway, it was, and then I got this flat, which was brilliant. It was a lovely flat. It had enough room for us to host CU in, and it was 45 quid a week in the centre of town. Every single house, basically, story I've had has a similar story like that, and I know Carmen's got similar things as well. There's also, for example, another example of times God's provided. When I was doing a Bible school in Toronto, I had my food and accommodation looked after, but everything else I had to do myself, and I allotted myself $300 for 6 months. And I ran out of that very quickly. I remember sitting, I think that the week I'd run out of the money, I was sitting in the church service going like, what am I going to do? And someone tapped me on the shoulder, I didn't know them, and they handed me $300. And they said, I think God's telling me to give you $300. And as soon as he gave me that, I felt God say, there's an offering in a moment, give $30. And with great reluctance, and kicking and dragging my feet and gnashing of teeth, I did. But it was, oh man, I was that close to not doing it. And I was like, God, this barely lasted me 3 months. Thank you for providing for the next 3 months, but I don't think I'll make it, God. I don't think you can provide. Anyway, I'd counted the money. It was definitely $300. I gave 30 reluctantly. And then I put it in a drawer back in my room, and the next day when I opened the drawer, there was still $300 there. Maybe someone put $30 in. Maybe God multiplied the money. I don't know. Either way, God provided. He was faithful. One more quick story, because that in both these examples is about sort of God providing, and I don't want you to get the message that God's a vending machine, that if we give, that he'll give back. So, again, when I was at uni, there was a time that I had a placement down in Teesside, and I managed to get a room, another God provision, room with a friend for 200 quid for the whole 2 months that I was there. And the uni, very generously, were giving me £1,000 bursary. And I was like, I am going on holiday. And I was thinking, this is brilliant. My expenses are going to be so low, and I'm just going to have a wonderful holiday at the end of the year. And God said, I want you to give £400 of that to someone else at church. I was like, hey. I can't go on holiday with that because I've got to eat for the next 2 months. And I won't have much left once I've got rid of 400. With great reluctance and gnashing of teeth and dragging my feet, I did that. And I did it anonymously because that's what I felt God to say. And the next week at church, she said that 3 days beforehand, which is a day after I'd given the money, she was a deadline for a missions trip that she felt God had been inviting her to do, and she had £400 left to go on this missions trip, and she wasn't going to be able to go, and then the £400 came through. And I didn't get £400 back after that. I wasn't able to go on that holiday that I planned. But I think actually, God provided for her missions trip. Did I need the holiday? It was good in my own eyes. but I did not. But actually, do you know what? That's a greater investment. And so do we recognize, and we talked a lot about money here, but actually, do we recognize that it's not just about money? Our time, our breath, our health, our careers, our future, our family. It's a long-term loan. Are we going to hold on to it? Or are we going to surrender it back to God? And this is about our hearts. If anyone's feeling guilty again, that they're not doing enough, stop. This isn't the point. It's for freedom that Jesus set you free. You are free from guilt, free from shame. Following this word might not even change your life. It could also shake it up radically. But I know that in this, I'm challenged. Are we seeking to take what we can from the world? Will we fall into debt in service to the gods of money, the gods of time, the gods of health, the gods of family? Or are we going to open up our hands and say to God, this belongs to you, do with it what you will? Can we prepare our hearts to be a provision for Newcastle, a provision of practical resource, a river of life pouring out?